Welcome back. We're live. This is Thomas here at Farmer for the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Joining me today are my co-hosts Michael Ganato and Raymond Perrier.
How's it going?
Today's topic is, a simple topic. What is truth?
Big T and little t.
Big T, little t truth.
Both of them.
Oh, I'm ready for this.
My favorite place to begin with this question is, there's a great line in, I think it's John's Gospel in the New Testament, where, Jesus is standing before Pontius Pilate, and he gives the lines, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And Pilate turns to him and he says, famously in Latin, is quid est veritas, what is truth? And that question is interesting because to answer it, you have to answer it at a number of different levels. And, you have to kind of make provisional assessments about what you mean by the very notion of truth. And then this, of course, is related to, well, if you have some conception about what constitutes truth, then entailed in that also is some idea about how you can discover truth, how you can verify it, whether or not. And if you can't do those things, can you even talk about truth?
Jared, let me ask you a quick question, because this is something that's always bugged me about that. So you have this infamous scene between Pilate and Jesus, and Pilate, because you have more of a religious background than me. So Pilate just drops this big ass question, what is truth? And then it just ends, and then it goes on to the next story. And I'm thinking well, hold on a second. What happened? What was the answer? What went down? That's something I've been meaning to ask you about, but I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yeah, well, you have to think of the Gospel of John as a closed rhetorical piece, right? So the entire Gospel is itself a literary production. And as a literary production, there's a lot of tropes and there's a lot of recurring themes within it. So to do it full justice, we would have to probably do an entire breakdown on the gospel itself.
We don't have to. I was just always curious
looking
about
at the Greek. But that question doesn't go unanswered. It goes unanswered in terms of the conversation ends at that point in the gospel. But that's a work, especially John's gospel as opposed to other gospels in the New Testament, or at least, even more so. This is for a specific community. And the subtext of the gospel is that what's being communicated to the audience is these are not works written for non-believers for the purpose of, evangelizing. These were works which are written for insiders. And so the subtext of this is he doesn't understand that the truth is standing in front of him. That's the subtext.
It's supposed to be like a reflection on Pilate himself.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be that the fact that Pilate walks away, or the fact that Pilate just sort of asks the question and then moves along, is supposed to be indicative of something about Pilate's character.
Yeah. So.
Oh, okay.
And you see this in several different places in the gospel. Also, in some cases, so Matthew's gospel, there's a lot of emphasis on Jesus as being a teacher. And so it's really interesting, who comes up to him in the Gospels and calls him Rabbi. So only believers come up and call him Rabbi in the Gospel. But if you actually go back and look at the Greek, and there's a moment when Judas betrays Jesus, that when he comes up to him, he doesn't call him Rabbi. And so it's this interesting turn in the gospel.
That's really interesting, but it has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about.
So this is a...
No, it actually ties in quite nicely when you think of the different forms of truth, big T, little t. On the one side, there's meaning making, there's the relative sort of webs or circles of truth that make up a person's orientation and thinking. And I think that, religious truth, religious beliefs sort of exemplify that to a certain extent. Insofar as the example we were talking about, Pontius Pilate being outside of the circle of truth that, is the Christian belief system, right? And then, counter that to forms of truth where we're going to talk about probability, correspondence, theories of truth, knowledge, objectivity, subjectivity. So I think that in some ways actually does kind of highlight some of the aspects we're going to get to.
Well, I think in the main, all right, so let's take the telescopic view of this first before we get into a lot of specifics, which I think that the place to start is with some definition about what we mean.
Oh, Lord.
Or at least some overview of ideas about how these things relate. Before you can problematize them, you have to have something out there before you can problematize it.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's a very large list. Just in pure, pure facts of like the list of terms that I can think of that fall under the discussion of truth. There is knowledge, the objective, the subjective, the correspondence, the probability,
coherence,
belief, facts, coherence. Yeah, all of these things, relativism, absolutism, all these things fall under the category. So there does seem to be that ability to separate two primary starting points, which is the meaning-making kind of truth versus the sort of like verifiability, that area.
That's a good distinction.
Truth about the world and reality versus, truth about the world as, we see it culturally, things like that. But what is truth? I guess there's something more meta there in the question than just those descriptions and categories, but we can maybe work backwards.
Well, I think when people typically ask this question, because, we've all had proper training in philosophy, and one of the things I don't want to do is to go through all the different various theories of truth that we just listed. But I think, you approach somebody on the street and you start talking, if you tell people you're a philosophy major, if you tell people you teach philosophy or whatever, I think there is an association between philosophy and a search for truth. And I think when people deal with the concept of truth, one of the basic questions they'll ask is, what is truth? And I think what they mean by that is there a sort of absolute truth? Is there a sort of Platonic truth? And by Platonic truth, I mean, is there something which is, as Raymond said earlier, capital T truth? Is there a truth which connects all other truths?
Some transcendence.
Yeah, some sort of unifying theory of truth, right?
Yeah, I think that's what most people would think about when they think about truth, right? Isn't that what you encounter?
I mean, if you're walking on the street and somebody comes up to you and, informal conversation, and then you tell them you're, a philosopher or religion scholar, and they say, oh, well, what is truth? They're probably just being a jackass. As if you could solve that, answer that question for them while you're passing them on the sidewalk.
In one sentence.
Sitting on a plane.
Yeah.
So we got a couple of hours to tell me what truth is. Well, I think, let's talk about that. I mean, yeah, we can think of something like the Platonic transcendent notion of truth, right? But that very notion itself, the idea is that I think that's still a species of something like correspondence. So a correspondence theory of truth generally, I think, is what most people think of in terms of their conception of the world as true. So a correspondence, a correspondence theory basically, for anyone who's unfamiliar with it, is that beliefs and statements which are made about the state of the world have to correspond to the way that the world actually is in order for there has to be some external referent for the things that you say. So if I say that there's a pink elephant in the room, right, then the truth or falsity of that statement is going to be determined by whether or not there is in fact a pink elephant in the room. right? That is that my statement,
Right.
based upon my belief, has to correspond accurately
Yeah.
with states of affairs, facts about the world.
Yeah.
Which is what I was trying to get across last time when we talked about fact versus opinion.
Oh my gosh, state of affairs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, which, to be fair, I think Wittgenstein introduced that. I could be wrong. That's probably entirely wrong, as a matter of fact, but I believe he used that terminology.
He did, but he also recognized that these were like relative spheres, states of affairs, and that there were overlaps, and that there were, completely contrary, language games that just counteracted to each other, contradicted each other.
Right. Different games.
Well, here's the thing that I think, okay? So there's something very pragmatic about viewing things in this way as a correspondence, right? Because you want to be able to provide some means of dismissing clearly factually incorrect things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I say there's a pink elephant in the room and there is no observational evidence to verify what I'm saying, right? These ideas are all kind of keyed together. Now, all these things have been problematized going back through, like, the history of philosophy, not just
right.
throw out a bunch of terms that we don't have time to explain, but, like the phenomenologists and the issue of structuralism. I think what's grounding a lot of these, particularly the structuralists and then, of course, the post-structuralists, were we don't want to get to a place where we think in terms of modernity that we're just like subjects observing a world of objects as through a plate glass window, right? That we're perfectly objective, that we're not conditioned by the world that we live in or the time and the place and the conditions of our existence.
Yeah.
And that we can find something like the big T truth, which is out there.
Yeah.
A lot of contemporary philosophy has problematized this by saying, no, look, you're very much conditioned by the language that you use, by the culture in which you find yourself, by just the conditions of being human, right? Going all the way back to Kant. The conditions of being human mean that you experience the world in a certain way through a certain biological lens. And so the really problematic factors in terms of trying to find the truth is to say how much of what we conceptualize as true is predetermined for us by the conditions of our existence, and how much of it is actually reflective of the world.
That's a meaningless question.
Yeah.
To say it's undiscoverable or unanswerable is not the same thing as saying it's meaningless.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's just that there's always this possibility of going deeper down the rabbit hole with questions like that, right? I mean, in order for you to definitively answer that question, you'd have to I don't even know what the criteria would be. I mean, the assumption goes back to, Berkeley's idea that there isn't anything that is meaningful or truthful that's not being perceived by some mind, right? And in his,
Right.
more interesting and very strange account, he says that we all exist in the mind of God, and that's how he accounts for this idea. But the question is still very interesting, and his critique of the question of finding the truth about the absolute truth is still very interesting, because it is that presupposition that there will always be a mind actively questioning or knowing or thinking about what really is the case. So does it even have meaning to ask the question, not because you can't answer it, but because it seems to circle back on itself constantly? And this would lead, I think, to some sort of logical absurdity, like an infinite regression that you couldn't escape. And I think that's the problem. Which gets really interesting when you start thinking more science fiction with all like the interaction with aliens.
Heck yeah.
But that's maybe a topic for another episode, Michael. Me and you will We'll do that when we do the Superman
I'll
one.
talk about some aliens all day long. We can go deep into some conspiracy. But I think that within terms of actual truth and not conspiracy, usually how I situate this conversation, and this is probably due in large part because I have training as a historian, but I like to situate it somewhat within a historical context, not to go too much in detail. But I think for most of human thought, for most of history, people have understood truth. I mean, I think correspondence theory of truth is one of the strongest, is in terms of like how many people believed it, is one of the most popular and strongest theories out there, dating all the way back to Aristotle for sure.
I think it's still a gold standard. It's just whether or not it's possible.
Absolutely. But I think in almost in juxtaposition to that, I probably shouldn't use juxtaposition if we're trying to. I hate when people do stuff. Anyway.
Don't juxtapose me.
I won't. But as another approach, I think what's interesting in terms of what's true is the split here between philosophy and religion. The split beginning with the ancient Greeks, both asking the question of how do we understand and explain the world. And how do we best understand and explain ourselves, and understand and explain everything from politics to biology to whatever? You have this basic distinction which has two different notions of truth that are operating within it, I think. And feel free to disagree. On the
you talking
one
about
hand,
the mythos logos distinction? Is that where you're going?
I don't know, because I don't know what you mean by that. But I would say,
don't throw those big words at him.
Yeah. Don't try that BS with me. I would say that with religion, you have an appeal to a sort of supernatural explanation, not only of reality, but of truth. With religion, you have this sort of, at least with the monotheistic religions, you have this sort of notion of absolute truth. As we began the conversation with Jesus, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. This idea that there is a grounding of truth in God or in some sort of supernatural reality. With the beginnings of philosophy, I think you have the first divergence from that. With philosophy, you have an explanation of reality that doesn't presuppose some ultimate grounding, some ultimate truth. And you see that in terms of philosophy's explanation, beginning with Thales, with his mathematical explanation about the eclipse, for example. I think that's the traditional starting place of philosophy.
Yeah.
So, but I think that people still approach this question of truth in similar ways. When people talk about truth, what they're asking about is there some sort of fundamental grounding for truth? Is there some sort of objective, overarching basis for truth?
Yeah. And Michael, would you say, because now we have that third rank within the truth-making world, which is, the scientific branch. Then this is a question to be interested in knowing what you have to say about. Can you have an absolute truth within science? Or is that really the one of the big issues, today? Because definitely the battles in truth are oftentimes between the religious side of truth, which is always striving for something absolute and metaphysical, versus
Right.
or not metaphysical, but still absolute, some kind of absolute truth about meaning making. But then you have the scientific, which is always juxtaposed to it, or at least put in a way that they are constantly in contradiction. Supposedly, is that because science is striving for an absolute truth, or is that like just a completely false starting point for having a discussion between science and religion?
I mean, there's a lot to that question.
Good luck.
To give to give a super brief answer and to follow it up with some historical BS, I would fall back on what I said in the previous podcast, in that science deals with probability, and that notions of truth are kind of foreign to science proper.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask a scientist, is this true, what you're doing? Of course they're going to say yes.
Yeah. Well, then that gets to the question, is truth law? Are laws truth? Are mathematical principles or formulas truth? And then I have another question when we get to, once you discuss that about the historical, because that's a question I'd like to ask you as well about science and history.
But I would say that if you look at the history of science, what the early modern scientists, well, I wouldn't make it, first of all, I wouldn't make a distinction in the early modern period between science and philosophy or in the ancient period. I mean, it's true. All one. I mean, if we want to be...
It is philosophy at that point still.
Yeah, it's...
Or religion, for that matter.
Yeah, or religion. I mean...
Well, they do make a distinction between theology. Religion as like a discipline was just after the modern period.
Right.
So, I mean,
if you look at modernity,
there's a little difference.
If you look at modernity, beginning of the modern period, 15th, 16th century, take your pick.
16th.
When you look at okay, whatever. Let's just ignore all of it. Anyway, damn it, Jared, you got me. Now you made me mad. If you look at I can't even think of what I was going to say. If you look at what these, quote unquote scientists were doing and what the quote unquote philosophers were doing, I mean, to be honest with you, the word science there is anachronistic. It doesn't really belong because they're doing the exact same thing. Interestingly enough, what the alchemists were doing and what the numerologists were doing and the astrologers were doing, that's all lumped in with the science as well. But that's for another podcast. So what they thought they were doing, which is what the ancient Greeks thought they were doing, they thought that they were trying to figure out how the world operates. And I would argue that they were also trying to figure out questions of ultimate truth. Where's God in all of this?
Well, absolutely, right.
What role does God play? Where is God? Physically, is he somewhere out there?
Yeah, they're trying to demonstrate God.
Yeah, I think that's what they're up to. Now, I don't think that's what scientists today are up to, but anyway.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then. So you mentioned, the scientific and then with reference to the historical. The question then is, and I asked this from my Wittgensteinian background. I have an interest in this, and I'd be interested in your take. Going backwards in time, are laws of science that are more or less considered, I would say, in more common discussions, absolute laws of physics, extend backwards in history? I mean, you can't, like gravity, for example, is a historical phenomenon that we would assume goes back, that people 1,000 years ago experienced. And by assume, I mean, we know that they experienced it.
Yeah.
And in that sense, when we talk about absolutes and truth, especially in historical, considerations of what absolute is, I mean, the temporal framework for discussing truth is a very real thing.
Yes.
Something that is absolutely true has to be true infinitely in time. It always is true, always and ever was and ever will be, kind of thing. And in that way, that it's an interesting discussion to say that science in some ways does deal in absolutes, or not. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Tell me what you think. No.
Oh gosh. I mean, you're just dropping the bombs on me, man, and putting me in this kind of corner here. All of that is philosophical language, which is sort of foreign to science, first and foremost.
I don't think scientists have a dog in that fight. They're not really interested if anybody.
They don't.
Yeah.
And they don't really care, to be honest with you. I don't think.
Well, some sciences do, right? I mean, some sciences depend on studying the past when we consider the age of the universe, when we consider, geology and their pursuits of, different forms of dating methods that are using scientific principles, they have to make some assumptions about the past that are in many ways absolute,
For sure.
even if they don't call it that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the most straightforward example I can think of, and then the one that I have the most experience with, you can think of the history of biology in the 19th century. Not to get too much into this. In terms of absolutes, I think what happens, there's a general, I think one of the hallmarks of Enlightenment science is a sort of, it becomes increasingly mathematical.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's mathematicalization. I don't know if that's a word.
It's on the internet now, so yeah, it is.
Okay. Is a sign of that discipline's maturity.
Yeah.
And you see that in biology as well. Biology pre-19th century is simply data collection.
Yes.
It's literally just people going out there and finding shit and putting it in a museum and saying, look at what I found. From collection, it becomes classification. Okay, how are we going to organize these animals?
Porphyry trees and
Where are we going to, these birds look similar to each other, so we're going to put them in the same category. These birds don't. Birds is the general category that we're going to use, so on and so forth.
Yeah, species, kingdom.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff like that.
What you learn early on, where biology becomes a science, so to speak, is when it starts to become mathematical, when it starts to become quantifiable, beginning with Lamarck, his zoological philosophy, who actually creates laws of biology, laws of inheritance. This is how the biological world works. And these laws are provable, they're testable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right. And then, of course, culminating with Darwin. But the question I think you're asking is would Darwinian evolution, or the neo-Darwinian synthesis now, is that an absolute truth? No, it's not. It's a.
And is that because in the future it could be proven wrong?
Well, it's kind of going back to what we talked about last time when we talked about facts. It's a theory which best describes the facts.
Yes. Okay.
And if we're dealing in terms of probability, it's the theory that overwhelmingly supports the facts. That is most likely to be the case. Now, that being said, the transition from Lamarck to Darwin, Darwin included Lamarck. He included Lamarckian evolution in his ideas. So there's a sort of absorption there, and a sort of transition then from one quote unquote theory to the next theory. I don't know if that's what you're asking, but in terms of truth, that's what you're dealing with in science. You see the exact same thing in the transition from Newton to Einstein, right? If you're talking about theories of gravity. So are scientific laws absolute within the context of the particular theory? Yeah, but that theory is, and God, I hate this word, and I hate even talking about this because it's only a theory BS. First and foremost, that's not, being a theory is a rank of high distinction in science. It's not like only a theory. It's like, holy shit, it's a theory.
Well, as I mentioned last time, so you propose a hypothesis, which is an explanation of a series of events, right? You propose a hypothesis, and then once you have a hypothesis which has been tested and has proved to actually account for the various observations, at that point it becomes a theory, and a theory which has been rigorously tested, right? A theory which has been subjected to attempts at disproving it over a long period of time, at least it is at least a candidate for the truth, right? Yes, you ultimately know that it could be one day overturned, but the more that it's tested and the more that it remains a viable a viable theory in the face of all of additional observations, the more confidence that you can have in it, right? It's always going to be probabilistic because it ultimately is always an empirical thing, right? Something that's just based on observations.
So in that sense, the question of truth isn't really applicable, right? Is it true? Is it not true? Doesn't really matter. It's the working theory that we have.
And I think that what I'm getting at, I was curious to know, because you study the sciences more directly than I do, but out in like the culture, especially American culture, and even the way that we raise children in America in the education system and the kind of foundations we give them, the sciences are treated in many ways as sort of the foundation of all thinking. And I think that, out in the world with people who are not professional scientists, I think that they treat these as if they are absolute truths. Evolutionary theory, especially people on the other side of creationists and the religious people who see, these confrontations between, which I don't think exists. And I think, the three of us would agree that there is no real great contradiction between science and religion. Oh, maybe you would. I don't think there is.
You would have to define science and religion
for another discussion.
Anyway, go ahead with your point, Raymond.
I'm gonna say hashtag my religion has no confrontation there, but definitely I think that there are a lot of people out there who think in terms of absolutes when they think of these scientific theories.
Yes.
But always the good scientist, is the one who's, just isn't going to answer the question, would just say, I don't know.
Right.
Well, that's just being responsible, right?
A responsible scientist, which is the majority.
Right.
Yeah, which I think brings us full circle in terms of responsibility. Being intellectually responsible means that you have to take into account the best available science, the best available information that you have at the present moment. So maybe something that we believe, almost certainly things that we believe will be disproven in the future, but at the present moment, it would be intellectually irresponsible to not believe those things. This is one problem that I have with the anachronistic study of, the history of thought, is frequently people will criticize people who are opposed to prevailing theories. If someone proposes a new hypothesis and then everyone universally is skeptical at the beginning, the way that this is pitted in terms of the narrative is, look at all these closed-minded people, right, who can't see the future. Well, until you have good evidence to support it, it would have been irresponsible for the people to believe that.
Exactly.
Yeah, very true.
I think that's a fantastic point, Jared, because people say the same thing, going back, people say the same thing about scientific theories. Well, one day it may be disproven. Yeah, one day it may, but that doesn't take away from the value of the theory. And that doesn't take away from the explanatory power of the theory. Because when people make that objection, they're assuming that truth doesn't change.
Yeah.
To put it one way. They're assuming that what's true is true and will always be true. And at least within a context of science, that's just not how it works.
So in this sense, I think it's pretty clear for us. I think we're in somewhat of agreement that scientific truth is with a lowercase t.
It's provisional. It's provisional truth.
And I would go out on a limb and say that provisional probabilistic truth is what we mean by truth. What I mean by truth, at least. That if you ask me about truth, that's what I'm going to tell you, because that's what it is.
So you're not even going to leave open the possibility of a capital T?
I wouldn't, no.
Okay.
I don't think I would.
And is that because so then let's get into this then. Let's get to that side of this discussion, because there's certainly tons of people in this world that believe in capital T truth.
Sure. Yeah.
What would fall under what kinds of judgments or entities of truth would fall under capital T truth?
Well, this would be getting too technical, I think, for the moment. I think that we would have to spend some more time explaining why this would be the case. But within the context of, say, medieval philosophy, you have an idea which is known as like the transcendentals. Right? So this would be something that you would see in like the work of Thomas Aquinas. So for someone like Aquinas, you would have a capital T truth, and that capital T truth would be the divine. But you would have to talk. There's a lot of conceptual work to explain why that would be the case. I think the easiest way to state it, though, would be to say that the divine is capital T truth, not that he possesses capital T truth, but that the divine is capital T truth. And the reason why that is because literally everything else, all contingent reality, is measured against that one absolute. And so if you want to know what capital T truth is, then it's the absolute against which everything else is measured. So really nothing else in contingent reality is true necessarily, right? It's only is itself only kind of passingly similar to the absolute. So to talk about capital T truth, I think, is something of a misnomer, especially when we're talking about our notions. Instead, I think that at least a more responsible way of discussing this would be to talk about what can we know with a high degree of probability, right? There's the difference between high degree of probability, responsible judgment, and certainty. I think virtually nothing is certain in the world, but I think that there are some things which you can know with a good deal of probability, that you can say with confidence, just like, and this is how you would make the distinction between people who say knowing falsehoods, right, under the assumption that, well, if there is no absolute certainty in the world, how can you have even provisional certainty about things? I think that's just being intellectually irresponsible, right? And I think that you see some of the cynicism.
So are you saying that we should just completely discount any form of absolute truth in this conversation?
I'll jump in real quick because I actually think we're having some technical problems with Jared here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I think even if you define like absolute truth using the same like standard that Jared did, that there exists some sort of absolute by which we measure all other contingent values or whatever mumbo jumbo that he spilled out there. And he's not here to defend himself, but yeah, I would say that
perfectly reasonable.
Right. I would say that, now, if you're committed to a certain set of religious standards, if you're committed to certain religious beliefs, then you are committed to that view. And I'm not sure that there's any way around that. But in terms of philosophy, in terms of epistemology, I think that is... I'm not sure that there's a point in talking about that, because you get into questions of evidence, you get into questions of probability. Again, how likely is that to be the case? So I would completely rule that out.
Well, there's certainly. I mean, even if let's put aside the religious absolutes, because that you have to grant some sort of you have to take a step to get from where we're talking to where we're going with that, and whether or not we want to say it's defensible is a whole nother discussion. But even from your perspective on the epistemological and the philosophical, there is certainly room for saying that there is non-demonstrably rational truths that could be taken in an absolute way. Simply by fact of the unveiling the rules of thinking, the way that people come to rational conclusions. There are certainly, paths of the mental processes that are, can be laid out philosophically, which would warrant being called absolutes for rationality.
Yes, I think that.
And they're very broad. I mean, absolutes have to be very all-encompassing,
Right.
right? As sort of like foundations for saying these are all the varieties of truth that we can come to, but there's still some underlying
Yeah.
principle that isn't demonstrable in an empirical way or even necessarily probabilistic, that we could say this is a criteria, a standard for even saying that something is probabilistic or truthful, that is inherently rational and basic to human thinking.
Yeah, so I'm okay with that. I'm okay with people believing that. What I'm not okay with is people then taking that and applying it to something like science.
No, absolutely. I think
Right.
that these are
Yeah.
different modes of awareness.
Right.
There's a connection, but not in a way that would, I'm very Kantian, and so that's why I'm bringing this up. Science in some ways works in the reverse, but there has to be a foundation in the human brain for us to even entertain the possibility of the world working on us in a way that we could come up with something like a fact,
So so I think this is what is causing our divergence here. So what do you mean when you say foundation in the brain?
Possibility of there being fundamental categories of thinking, whether it's biological in the way that we sense the world, see it in shapes,
Okay.
interpret it, are able to intelligently analyze these things, which then we get into the probabilistic very quickly, but there's at least something back there that has to be sort of presupposed, right?
Okay, no, I can get on board with that. The problem when people bring up Kant and when they start talking about foundation is I'm not always clear whether they're talking about like some sort of external rational foundation or whether they're talking about the simple way in which our brain sort of frames our thinking. In which case, if you're going to say that human reason, that our reasoning and that our experience of the world is framed within certain biological / psychological context, absolutely. But if you're going to say that there are these like rational laws or rules which govern our thought, then I would say we're getting into kind of murky territory.
Not rules or laws that one discovers out in the world as if they're these entities that we have to find, like we're
Gotcha.
When we discovered the continents, right? But rules and laws that well, for what you said earlier, theories within a theory, there is some sense of an absoluteness, whether it's relative, being insofar as it's only relative to that theory, that's one thing, but there is some sense of absoluteness. I think that the way in which we measure even the absoluteness of a theory, its intelligibility and its efficiency and accuracy, is in large part due to this simultaneous development in our rationality that goes hand in hand with it. They sort of reinforce each other. You couldn't have one without the other,
right?
And in that sense, what it means to be rational is absolute, insofar as it's relative to those standards of rationality. But there's still something there that's absolute, I think, because getting back to Kant, when we talk about Kant, he's definitely, and not just Kant. There are a lot of people historically that talk about anthropology in such a way that human beings are not necessarily rational just because they're born human.
Yeah.
They become rational, they develop these things, but there is still a sort of standard criteria for what they have to, adopt as a part of their rationality that's kind of already been set out for them by society. And it changes,
Yeah.
But there's still something sort of absolute in those relative moments.
That's a really interesting point. And I've thought about this. I'm not sure I'll be able to articulate it all that well, but what's interesting to me about that, and I'm sure you can provide some insight. I'm interested in the ways, like when we talk about intelligence, almost always what we really mean is like human intelligence, and to qualify it as human intelligence, I think, is to assume that our intelligence is shaped in certain ways. And so I'm willing to go along with what you're saying to that degree, that there is that rationality, as long as we're talking about human rationality, right? That there are certain standards, and you can call these absolute standards, I think, if you want to, that there are certain absolute standards when it comes to human rationality. There are certain things, there are certain ways in which we as humans generally perceive the world and generally understand and explain the world. And you can even apply that to evidence. There's general sorts of evidence that we as humans take to be good evidence and bad evidence. Where I would want to pause and to talk about more is when human rationality becomes, and this is the same problem we've been talking about, I think, but when human rationality becomes capital R rationality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think in that case, it's a difficult distinction to maneuver around sometimes. But just like there's capital T, there's also capital R, and I think in the case of rationality, I think it's, so humans are intelligent insofar as they're capable of rationality. I think that's almost more biological and neurological, but rationality itself, I don't think is innate. And I think that was something that even going back as far as the early moderns, they recognized that to some extent. Some circles were more stupid about making that distinction because they this idea of an innate, rationality, and then basically using that as a mean of excluding people like women or, the African races, the African tribes, the, Islamic tribes that they encountered as being less than human. But that's not a philosophical claim. That's an anthropological claim that they were making that was ungrounded and not very well spoken. And I think that insofar as we think in terms of the absolute and the relative, and maybe this is where we should take this in terms of truth and in rationality in general, even within a relative circle, whether it's a circle of context, a political circle, a circle of history, there is some sense of the absolute working that kind of guide the rules in engagement. And in that way, I think that's this weird thing about the absolute and relative when we apply those terms, is because you'd think that they'd be contradictory, but I think they actually kind of work to sort of mutually condition one another. Then the real question is how do we get from event to event, right? How do we get from change one point to the next point? How does that work if there are these absolutes within these relative spheres? I think it's because, this is my Wittgensteinian sort of background and application of Kant, which is maybe a no-no, but I do it anyways. I think it's when you encounter those other circles, those overlaps tend to change, the game.
So there's a lot there.
There's not that much.
There's a lot there. I want to ask you about. I just
maybe it's gotten too crazy.
No.
Anyways,
but what I'm trying to say is that Jared just texted me his phone's dead and he can't use the headphones with the computer. So I guess we can stop here.
Okay, that sounds good. This has been Front Porch Philosophers talking to you about truth. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We're going to do a second episode next week to continue the conversation, and Jared will join us again. Have a good week. Bye-bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Front Porch Philosophers. If you did, go follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch. If you liked it so much that you want to support us monetarily, then go to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers and become a $1 subscriber today. Every dollar goes to adding more content and buying up more server space, so the more you spend, the more you get. In any case, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Front Porch.